We will talk about Ukraine's positions in the negotiations, what the reduction of our army to 800,000 soldiers will mean, and today's attack with the commander of the 429th Separate Regiment of Unmanned Systems, Achilles, Yurii Fedorenko. Yurii, hello.
Glory to Ukraine.
Glory to the heroes. Thank you for taking the time to join our stream. How do you assess the strategy that the Russians are currently using? Is there even a strategy for strikes on the Ukrainian rear?
Let's talk about what goals and objectives the enemy sets for itself. If you look at the categories of targets that they hit with their drones, we will start with critical infrastructure facilities that are responsible for ensuring the livelihood primarily of the civilian population of Ukraine. Next, energy facilities. The enemy wants to plunge us into darkness. Next, the enemy systematically hits residential buildings, hospitals, and kindergartens. The question arises, why is it necessary to terrorize the civilian population? It would be logical to hit energy infrastructure facilities. And why hit residential buildings? Why hit children's hospitals? The answer lies on the surface. For the enemy, the division of Ukrainian society is fundamentally important. Also, the enemy very clearly understands the previous pages of history and the weaknesses of the Ukrainian people. First of all, the enemy tries to increase discord. The enemy also has a very good experience in conducting hostilities, in particular in Chechnya. And as a result, then the tactics of destroyed villages to the foundations gave the result. Those who supported a free, independent Chechnya, one way or another, were partially inclined to end hostilities at any cost. With this experience, the enemy pursues several important points which concerns the Ukrainian people. First, to force Ukrainians to leave our country, that is, to go abroad. Next, the enemy is trying to achieve that we will not have a common position and will be ready for peace on any terms. This is the second component. The enemy is pushing the presence of war deep into our territory, into rear cities, in order to force Ukrainians to accept any conditions. And, of course, the third component. Russians are terrorists who understand the following truth: that the war is always won by the people. The armed forces or the army will only win the battle. So, if the Ukrainian people are weakened, then, according to their convictions, the front line of combat may also weaken, where, despite the unprecedented onslaught, probably for the entire period of the full-scale war, the enemy is stalling. Yes, there are tactical successes, but in general, with so many losses of forces and means, the enemy is stalling. Therefore, it is absolutely clear that the enemy is now setting the task first to obtain the best components, which China is kindly providing. The components used to assemble the Shaheds, Gerons, and the components used to assemble the CRP antennas, which make the aircraft more protected against Ukraine's electronic warfare systems. And it is expanding additional production in order to increase the number of manufactured strike-type units to at least 600 per day. But in general, the enemy is trying to achieve much larger goals in terms of quantity. What is the enemy constrained by now? Why can't it carry out such massive attacks every night? It needs a certain amount of time in order to reassemble. It is currently limited by the trained human resources. In my opinion, I may be wrong, but understanding the physics of the process, it is most likely limited by personnel who are able to analyze, plan missions, as well as the amount of equipment, as well as positions for the simultaneous launch of certain means. In particular, if we are talking about Shaheds as well. Therefore, it is absolutely obvious that, unfortunately, the terror of Ukrainian cities and towns will continue. The enemy will increase the number, and the enemy will try to deploy a larger number of troops, namely those responsible for striking the territory of Ukraine. When it comes to personnel potential, there is a place to draw young people from. The enemy is actively taking measures on its territory to unite young people. Active youth in public organizations such as United Russia, Great Russia, and other ones. These are boys and girls aged 17 and a half years, 17, that is, of pre-conscription age. After completing the courses, it is proposed to sign a contract with the Russian occupation forces. Now the following question arises: what do we, Ukrainians, need to do to prevent the enemy from achieving its goals? In fact, the answer is on the surface. We could endlessly grit our teeth and say that our partners are to blame for everything because they could have launched combat aircraft from Polish territory and used them to at least cover part of Ukraine by shooting down aerial targets. But they do not do this, and, most likely, in the near future they will not find the courage to perform such tasks. Therefore, we must protect ourselves with what we have. If we are talking about missile weapons with which the enemy attacks our cities and towns, of course, we will not go anywhere. We need an appropriate nomenclature of air defense systems, in particular such as Patriots, and a certain amount of ammunition for them. As you know, Ukraine is to receive additional Patriot systems, as well as to be supplied with the necessary amount of ammunition. Of course, this will not close the entire territory of Ukraine, but it should close key facilities. In addition to that, we are talking about the arrival of aviation into Ukraine, but we always have to understand that this is a long time. Pilot training is a complex process that requires time, instruction, and then implementation on the battlefield for a specific vehicle, which may be additionally supplied to the Ukrainian state. Therefore, missile weapons, of course, are the prerogative of our partners and our military political leadership of the state, which gains that for the Ukrainian state to protect our skies. As for the fight against drones, the fight against drones is divided into a certain number of echelons. Of course, this is a common electronic field, which allows you to detect air targets, to see an enemy drone in the air. Next, how can we knock it down? It's not a secret, I'm not revealing the details of the technical specifications, but the enemy understands my words. I'm just trying to explain to Ukrainians, and understanding the process can make it possible to make appropriate decisions. So, the first stage we have to say about air defense systems, both stationary and portable, which are supplied to us by our partners. The next is maneuverable fire groups. One way or another, they partially retain their relevance and are able to shoot down targets flying at a sufficiently low altitude that is achievable for aimed fire from heavy machine guns. Next is the Ukrainian combat aviation, which hardly ever publicizes its work but operates under very difficult conditions. The load is enormous, and their effectiveness is quite high. I don't quite understand what's happening in light aviation. You know, to put it for those who aren't familiar with the details, like in World War II, these are propeller-driven planes. It would be very good that they also put on combat duty, because they could effectively work against the Shaheds. And I will say more, that there were such cases in Ukraine. There were groups that brought down big numbers. But, most likely, there are risks of recognizing friend or foe in the sky and, as a result, limiting the number of pilots who could operate with these means. But I believe that equipping with such means, as well as training pilots, is one of the tools for defending the Ukrainian sky. And, of course, these are air defense systems, our interceptor drones of various modifications, both those manufactured by partners and, for the most part, those manufactured by Ukraine. And I am convinced that each of you has heard at least once, and someone even donated to the purchase of such means. They make it possible to effectively close our Ukrainian sky. But behind every drone that flies to shoot it down, there is a person. This is someone who was mobilized into the armed forces of Ukraine through the recruitment system into a specialized unit responsible for defending the Ukrainian sky, engaging in the downing of aerial threats. Who has completed general military training, undergone specialized preparation, participated in unit coordination exercises, received the necessary equipment through the support of Ukrainians, as well as the Ukrainian state and our partners, and has secured their portion of the sky. The more people we recruit who will be able to perform these tasks throughout Ukraine, now we are not talking about the front line of combat exclusively, we are talking about defense echelons, the fewer shaheds and gerons will reach our cities. The enemy understands that we have already partially completed this task. And objectively, if you count how many units entered our airspace and how many were shot down, in particular by interceptor drones, this is a significant proportion, more than a significant proportion. To conclude the thought, the more pieces of the Ukrainian sky we cover, the fewer strikes will reach us. The fewer strikes that hit our critical infrastructure facilities, our enterprises and industries, the less the Ukrainian people will be terrorized, and people will continue to stay in Ukraine, work and pay taxes, and the more capabilities we will have to develop the next stage. These are the possibilities of destroying on the territory of the Russian Federation those enterprises that manufacture components, those facilities that store components which are imported from the Russian Federation, those enterprises that form the finished product, as well as launch sites. A comprehensive approach is needed to destroy this infrastructure. By a comprehensive approach, we mean our deep strikes. These are planes, drones that hit certain targets on the territory of the Russian Federation every day, as well as missile weapons. And here, addressing our partners, once again, we have to say that this is a great miracle, luck and painstaking work, that the Ukrainian missile program remains, and we have specific samples that show effectiveness, but there are very few of them. In order for us to be able to provide a comprehensive impact and deprive Russia of the potential to manufacture and launch such drones, we must strike with all available missiles that are in service with our partners, the countries of the European Union, which are members of the North Atlantic Alliance, as well as, in particular, the United States. And when we talk about missile weapons, this is not Ukraine's desire to hit Russia. This is a necessity for Ukraine, to protect its citizens by destroying the facilities that manufacture and subsequently launch those drones against us, against our children, against our women, against our fathers. Therefore, the issue can be solved comprehensively. In the direction of interception, Ukraine is developing rapidly. In the direction of deep strike, Ukraine is developing very rapidly. In the direction of missiles, without our partners, of course, it will be very difficult to fully fulfill these tasks. We also have to say about other structural units that are actively involved in the formation of prerequisites for timely detection. And as a result, we mostly know about the threat of a missile strike, as well as about the threat of a shard strike, in advance. This is only partially relevant to frontline cities, like Kharkiv, because sometimes the strike happens first, and only after that does the air raid alert go off. All this happens in other frontline cities. For example, in Pokrovsk, not in those settlements that are relatively far from the front line on the Pokrovsk direction, there are also instances when you can hear the siren. First, the strike hits, and only then does the siren start to sound. What am I talking about? In most of Ukraine, such units and means of reconnaissance still give us opportunities for early detection. I sincerely ask and call on Ukrainians. I know that the fatigue from the full-scale 4-year war, and overall since 2014, has a cumulative effect. And it seems that it will be easier, but it is getting harder and harder. But at this point, we become stronger. We can survive, we must kill for Ukraine, we must work with all our might. But in order to realize all this, we must be alive. In order to be alive, when you hear an air raid siren, I sincerely ask you to use shelters. I know that not all of Ukraine, not all places have them properly equipped. I know what is happening in a number of cities, in particular in the capital, when these premises are occupied by antisocial elements for one reason or another. But you must do everything possible to protect your life and health, the life and health of your relatives and friends. And then we are guaranteed to be able to survive.
Yurii, I am very grateful to you for this call, because it is extremely important, and in our broadcasts we also call on our viewers. Please do not neglect it. Prioritize your life, health, family, and friends. I also have the following question for you. I know this isn't a political discussion, but I'd like the military's opinion. How do you feel about those points of the peace plan that are currently known? Right now, negotiations are happening non-stop, and in Abu Dhabi, the Ukrainian, Russian, and American sides are meeting. The need to negotiate with Russia. What will this lead to, in your opinion?
Right now, you're pulling me onto thin ice. I'll try to answer.
I want to hear the position of a military person.
I understand. The military is part of society, these are your neighbors of yesterday. Therefore, there is no consensus among us either. Everyone will have their own. I can only express my opinion as a citizen of Ukraine, Yurii Fedorenko, and analyze it so that it is not baseless. Look, every time we have questions in our society related to the fact that there will be an end to hostilities, I'll remind those who don't remember that when President Trump was running for office, he said, "One day it will all be over, I'll reach an agreement with everyone, everything will be fine." And at that time, we were just beginning to recruit the regiment. There was a huge decline in the number of people who volunteered to join the army, including our unit. The number was not the same as usual. Additionally, donations dropped as well. I then thought, how does this happen? Then, a few months ago, authoritative people came out and said, the war will end in January. People who have significant authority in society on religious grounds are leaders of public opinion on other grounds. And exactly the same thing happens in our country, a decline begins. Next. Peace plan. I will say this in parentheses, but the peace plan. And what is happening in Ukraine now? We need to talk about it. First, those who are liable for military service but have not been mobilized to date, they think like this. If the war ends in the near future, then why will I mobilize, change my usual way of life and potentially take risks while in the Ukrainian army? Business that supports the army, for medium-sized businesses right now, as you know, it's far from easy. They are going through some of the most difficult times. It is also difficult for big business. And the economic situation in the country as a whole, let's be honest, is not the best. As a result, people were already giving their all, and now they say, the war may end. As a result, the one who could previously give 2 hryvnias now does not give anything. Someone who previously gave a comfortable 50 and could stretch to 100 might now only give 20 or hold back entirely. The war will end, why spend this money? It is better to spend it on yourself or buy something, reinvest it somewhere. The same is true for business. Those who serve the military-industrial complex think, who doesn't have contracts now? Why should I buy components for millions of hryvnias? Ukrainian companies, mainly components for assembling UAVs. If the war ends, then we need to look for another way out. It is necessary to start making thermoses, for example. Conventionally speaking, it is probably necessary to purchase components for this to reintegrate the market. As a result, we are falling short in terms of attracting the main capital of the war, people to the armed forces of Ukraine, as well as in donations and funding for the defense forces through the support of the Ukrainian people and Ukrainian businesses. What is happening in Russia? And we must always look broadly and analyze with a cool mind. The situation there is as follows. Their citizens think like this. If there is going to be an end to the hostilities, and it all seemingly points in that direction, then urgently, yesterday if possible, people will need to sign a contract with the Russian occupation forces and receive bonuses. Their army continues to be mercenary, they are paid significant amounts of money for signing contracts and mobilization. I need to sign this contract, and as a result, the war will end, I will receive bonuses, and everything will be fine. What happens next? Then everything changed. Neither a contract is signed, neither predictions, nor authoritative people, nor fortune tellers, nor sorcerers, nor anyone come true. The war continues, unfortunately. As a result, during this time, we fell short in our capabilities and resources, we didn't prepare enough, didn't train enough, didn't mobilize enough, and didn't provide enough support. And at that moment, the enemy had a number of personnel, because they all came to simultaneously sign a contract to receive a monetary reward. And as a result, they then have someone to continue active hostilities with. This is the first component. Second, I do not know the final version, which is now being announced on social networks and in the media, which has been agreed upon at the current point in time. But I have to say from the previous ones, 29 points, and in general, if they continue to be maintained. Let's get into the story. After the First World War, Germany had a ban on increasing the size of its army. I can't remember what number there was, how many thousands. What was the reason for this? Because Germany lost, and as a result, other countries had to have a clear guarantee that they would not renew their capabilities militarily, that there would be no more action, or that they would not unite with allies to wage hostilities against certain countries that were among the victors. Ukraine does not seem to have lost, and Ukraine, in my opinion, will definitely survive. So how can anyone in the world tell us how many troops we should have? Only the Supreme Commander-in-Chief and the Commander-in-Chief should talk about this, because the Commander-in-Chief knows better, understanding the completeness of the information, how many troops we need in order to cope with the threats that may arise in the foreseeable future. Next, they accuse us of not being able to maintain an army. The army needs even more money than is allocated now. And I'll explain why. In the event of the end of hostilities, God forbid that this happens with the benefit of Ukraine, the military, who have gained some experience, expertise, and are smart, will begin to receive salaries without combat pay. How much do they get without combat pay? A soldier receives 20,000 hryvnias. Now tell me, will a young, healthy guy who's smart, has a family, stay in the armed forces of Ukraine, with all his love for the country, for 20,000 hryvnias? Staring at shop windows, saving up for a year to buy his wife a birthday gift when he has the option to work for a private company, particularly a European one, earning $5,000 to $10,000 a month, or for a private Ukrainian company in the private sector, earning $2,000 to $5,000. It is impossible, I apologize, again with respect to all professions, but a security guard in the supermarket cannot receive more than a soldier in the armed forces of Ukraine receives. Or in shopping center. I'm not making any specific references, so that there won't be any conflicting situations later. It can't be that way. So, to maintain our military, one of the points in the agreement, an agreement that should be signed, exhaustive, and in favor of the Ukrainian state, must include stable funding from our partners for the armed forces of Ukraine, taking into account the personnel numbers we can, and see that we can, expand too. This is essential for ensuring the security factor of our state, as well as considering social guarantees and salaries for servicemen. That's what you need to think about. Now, I think that we need to briefly talk about what will happen if we do not receive clear guarantees, one of which I have named. We will not have enough time if we can go through each item separately. In the event that hostilities are frozen, and there are not just clear guarantees, consistent steps and funding to ensure that our military remains strong and retains personnel in it, the following will happen. The state of Ukraine will begin to fly into the political process. It is so obvious that elections should be held after the end of hostilities. During political processes and elections, we'll be hearing things that will make our hair stand on end. They will be throwing accusations at each other, both about what happened and what didn't happen. There will be a certain political crisis caused by the election race, the struggle for votes, and then the actual completion. Then, for a certain period of time, until they settle into their positions. Next, a certain part of Ukrainians will definitely go abroad, some will return, but we will lose the expertise of the troops. Every service member who has been fighting since the first day of the full-scale war remains in the ranks today, has progressed in rank, starting as an infantryman, a soldier, then becoming a squad leader, a platoon leader, and later a company commander. There are those who have already risen to the rank of battalion commander. Their expertise is insane. This is something that no money in the world can buy. This is only something that can be experienced and have this expertise. You can learn this partially, but in order to become a professional, you need to feel it. It doesn't work any other way. As a result, we will lose this expertise as well. Next, what will happen in Russia? The Russian Federation will regroup, sanctions will be lifted, and as a result, it will be able to deconserve all possible processes for the trade in oil products, fill its budget. I think that energy resources will partly go to the European Union in greater quantities than those currently supplied by the Russian Federation to some European countries. And as a result, Russia will work on the mistakes that were made, regroup its troops and modernize weapons. And then the next part of the Russian-Ukrainian war, and possibly the Russian-Ukrainian-European one, will begin. Perhaps so, because the enemy also has such plans. And what are we going to have? We will have a Russian-trained army, which has expertise, equipment and capabilities. And we will have an army in Ukraine that is not prepared for the challenges that will await us on the front line. I can even tell you when such a war could potentially begin. Let's analyze together and remember it. Donald Trump is the president of one of the largest countries who was legally elected. I cannot criticize the choice of the Americans. I cannot criticize the president, although sometimes, let's say, I really want to say everything I think. At the moment, he is guided, in my opinion, not by the interests of the United States, not by the interests of the North Atlantic Alliance or the European Union, and even more so not by the interests of Ukraine. In this life, he probably achieved everything that a person could wish for, made all dreams come true. But there is one point that is not closed. This is the Nobel Peace Prize. He seeks to get it. We saw how it happened in 2025, and it didn't work out. And in the event of the end of hostilities on unfavorable terms, he can potentially receive it. And believe me, there will be no active hostilities again until the end of President Trump's term. But we must understand, Trump became president for the second time, a third time, according to the Constitution of the United States, he cannot. It is also impossible to change the Constitution, as in Russia, for a life term. So he will definitely no longer be president. After this turbulence of President Trump's impulsive policies, it is absolutely obvious, 95%, that the Democrats will come to power. And when Trump leaves the Oval Office, leaves the White House, ceases to be president, the next day the war will begin. And then Trump will say the following: look, when I was president, I reconciled and united the whole world. Everyone began to feel normal, most of the conflicts are over, even such a complex conflict as Russia's war against Ukraine. And as soon as power passed into the hands of these people who represented Biden, to the Democrats, you see, it all started again. Therefore, it can be a multi-move. Of course, we do not know everything that is happening behind closed doors because we see what is happening on the surface, what is being talked about, but what agreements are being signed there on financial and economic relations and between which countries, it will remain a secret forever. We will not have access to that. But we must remember that each state works in the interests of its state in the first place. And if it is beneficial for Europe for Ukraine to resist, then they finance us. But sometimes it feels like it's not in anyone's interest for us to win this war because objectively, by 2022-2023, we could have pushed them all the way to the border. I believe that this was possible at that time. There was a set of troops, but there was no set of equipment that was promised. The situation could look completely different on most of Ukraine. But it's a completely different story. Now we need to concentrate on supporting the institution of the president. Again, the president may be liked or disliked depending on the specific name. You can support a specific name or not, but as an institution, you need to support the president because he is the main captain in the conditions of a full-scale war, without unnecessary exaggeration, on our submarine, from which there is no way out. And a weak president is a collapse for our state. A strong president is an opportunity to resist. It just so happened. Such was the credit of trust, and such people are now in office. No matter how anyone assesses. But even in this matter, we must maintain absolute unity.
Yurii, I am very grateful to you for such a very balanced position and for your correct narratives that you are now conveying to our people.